Cohen, do you want to add anything before we begin questions and answers?
No, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Gauthier did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Gauthier. At the beginning of your comments, you mentioned the management relationships that's better in the Office of Science, those 10 labs you said, than the others. Does that require some act of Congress to change that, or is that something the department can itself change?
Most of the things we recommend are actually within the authority of the department now. Certainly in these management areas, almost all of them, they have the authority to implement. It's just a question of willpower and actually going ahead and doing it.
Well, does it depend? I mean, you're an experienced person in government as well as outside government. Does it depend on the personality of the secretary, or are there changes that Secretary Moniz could make during his last year here that would likely carry over for other secretaries? Well, maybe it's not his last year, but let's say in the remaining part of the Obama administration.
That's right, exactly.
We like him.
He's doing a good job, and I think the relationship that he is establishing with the laboratories is healthier, and many of the things that he is doing now are consistent with the recommendations we're making.
Yeah.
Some of those things he may be able to try to institutionalize or to put in place in a way that continues, but a lot of it depends upon the culture at the department and between the department and the labs, and that culture change is not something that can be legislated or can be changed overnight. And it requires work on both sides, both at the laboratories and the department. It's moving in the right direction. I think if it gets the reinforcement that your committee can provide, that will help a lot.
You have made this report to him, or will make it, you will give it to him?
We've delivered it to him. We'll be meeting with him in coming weeks. We have met with him during the course of this work as well.
Let me ask you about third-party financing. You've been in the Department of Energy. You've been in the Office of Management and Budget. And I'll just use the experience I know best at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. I mentioned earlier there are 4 major buildings there that have been done by what we call third-party financing. In our experience was, I believe one of them was made it possible for us to move on into the supercomputing much more rapidly than we otherwise would have been able to as a government. The cost of the buildings was roughly half of what it costs to build federally financed facilities, and the facilities were completed in about half the time. Now, since 2007, there have been no approvals by the Office of Management and Budget of third-party financing at our national laboratories. What's going on? You used to be in the Office of Management and Budget. Why are they not doing that?
Mr. Chairman, I think your example is a very good one. There are 3 different forms of financing that were used in those buildings, and those 3 did illustrate the differences that you just cite. One of them was funded completely by Department of Energy funding, one was funded by the state, and one was funded by private sector funding. And the results were that the alternative financing approaches were much better. The reason it's not being done right now is partly a set of rules that the Office of Management and Budget has adopted in the interests of trying to protect the federal treasury. It is true that the borrowing rates for the federal government are lower than they are for the private sector, but if that's all you look at, then you're missing the bigger part of the picture. If you can build a building overall for less cost, then the borrowing costs are also going to be substantially lower, and the net overall is the benefit.
Do you think it was just a some people think that every time the private sector gets involved, that's a bad thing. I'm on the other side of that argument, but in this case, we had 3 or 4 examples down there, and generally speaking, the savings was half the time and half the cost, so one would think that protects the taxpayer's pocketbook.
And our recommendation in the report is that OMB ought to, and everyone in the government ought to be able to do a straightforward cash flow comparison of building a project one way, building it the opposite way, and look at that and be able to make a decision that is in the best interest of the government, but not to have, in what we see in some cases, sort of arbitrary rules. There are some of the rules that we don't understand the rationale for them. our recommendation is that your committee, its staff, the Department of Energy, and OMB ought to work together and see if you can agree upon what the situations ought to be in which innovative financing would be appropriate and what the procedures or what the rules would be for how you do that.
Well, Senator Feinstein, I think we ought to follow up on that recommendation and see if we can, if there are appropriate instances where we can save the taxpayers money. I mean, half the time and half the dollars, then we ought to consider that. I had a meeting with the Office of Management and Budget the other day on another matter. I found Sean Donovan to be very open and receptive. And are you planning to give your recommendations to the Office of Management and Budget?
Yes, we are, and we've met with them during the course of this, and we will be meeting with them again. And we're trying to get them to understand the rationale for our recommendations so that they, we would hope, would adopt them and look into them more deeply.
Well, I would appreciate your doing that, and after you do that, perhaps we can follow up. Senator Feinstein.